Gang, what if I told you that the single greatest education in the world, without any exaggeration, is available to you right now, to you and to your children, right this very second? What if I told you that that education is also the single greatest antidote to the woke insanity that pervades our nation? And what if I told you that that single greatest antidote to woke insanity is precisely the kind of education that all of our founding fathers received and gave to their children? Well, that is what we're going to discover today with my dear friend and guest, David Goodwin. David is a founding board member and was headmaster of the Ambrose School in Boise, Idaho, which I've had the honor of visiting and speaking at. And he is currently president of the Association of Classical Christian Schools. He's the editor of the Classical Difference magazine. He has a new book out that you've got to get entitled Battle for the American Mind, Uprooting a Century of Miseducation. He co-authored it with Fox News's Pete Hegseth. He's been on Fox News. He's talked with Newt Gingrich on it. Just came out in January. It's absolutely taking the educational world by storm. So we're going to talk about that, the central role of education and culture and society. We're going to talk about what went wrong with our educational system and how classical Christian education offers us a faithful way back. So, David, it's been far too long. I enjoyed our conversation before we started the recording. If you guys don't know, David and I have spent many, many hours in the wee hours of the night with Scotch cigars and glorious conversation. And my friend, it's been too long. It's great to see you again.
Indeed, it has. I don't know if your regular listeners know just how significant a role you play in the classical Christian world.
Oh, man. Thank you for that. That's wonderful. Yeah, well, I really, as you know, I'm passionate about classical education. I was in it for 18 years. A lot of people know my story of how I gone to the channel full time. But my heart has never, ever left classical education. My kids are still involved in it. And I am passionate about getting everybody watching this involved with this. There are going to be some links underneath the video here that you can click on to find a local classical school, to avail yourself of David's work. And congrats on that book, by the way, The Battle for the American Mind. That's really, it's made its way up the charts, as it were. Why don't you just give us a quick, little précis of what motivated you to write the book and what it's about?
Well, Steve, in many ways, I think you, along with a handful of others that we all have been hanging around with for many years, told this story in various ways and at various conferences over a long time. And what I realized was that nobody had really recorded it in a way that the average person could just pick it up, read it, and have an epiphany about the way education has changed and what opportunity there is in classical Christian education. So that was my original intent as I wrote the book originally. But because I was trying to reach outside our circles, and you know this, I know you've published books in a lot of different, many different of the classical press, like classical academic press and what have you. But I was trying to get out into the broader audience, and it's not easy to do that. People, education was a sleeper topic in 2019 when I was fishing this book around, and the prospect of an unknown author wasn't all that attractive to many of the publishers. So the great story of this book was the Lord's timing and Pete Hegseth coming along and saying, look, this is such an important story. If they won't publish you, they'll publish us. And so he wrote a little more than 4 of the chapters and did a really good job with them. Brought something to the book that I could never have brought, sort of a really easy to connect with tone. And it's an easy read, but it is packed with stuff you probably never heard.
It is, and it's really neat. I've been checking out a lot of the interviews you guys have been doing together. Really enjoyed the one with Newt Gingrich. That was on his podcast. That was really substantive, quite wonderful. And what's interesting to me, and we've talked about this in so many ways, being in the world of classical education and training teachers, interestingly enough, which was something I've loved doing, I've always been fascinated by when I ask the question, what is education? I've always been fascinated by the blank looks I would get on everyone's faces. It's almost like, what was it? Augustine said something about time. If you never think about it, you know what it is, you know what time is. And so, but then if somebody asks you, what is time itself? All of a sudden you have no idea, right? That's
yeah.
Right. It was like, that's what I was like, not just with students. I did it with my students all the time, but I would do it with teachers when we were in the, teacher training situation. What is education? What is it that you are actually doing? And you get these kind of blank stares. Can you draw that out for us? This Latin term, educare. What is actually education?
Well, I will have to yield to you on the Latin. I'm not, my key contribution to this project was that I sat and listened to you and, a dozen other guys like you, and I took the stuff and put it in language that people could understand pretty easily.
Right.
But, one of the things I tell the story in the book, I think that the first time I heard Andrew Kern's definition of classical education, which is, the cultivation of wisdom and virtue by means of the seven liberal arts, that is what education is.
Yes.
It's just very hard to unpack all those words. What is virtue? What is wisdom? Right. What is the seven liberal arts? And then you get the seven of those and take them apart, and it's like a Swiss watch, a very small thing that when you take it apart gets really complicated fast.
Yeah, and that the whole notion of virtue and wisdom. I mean, we've even forgotten what those terms are, which we're going to get into as we go through. Yet one of the things, the reason why I like that the Latin term is educare, meaning to lead out, to be drawn somewhere, and especially in the case of all these, the libs of TikTok videos that we're seeing here, what kids are learning in the classroom today. The key question to that is where are your children being led? Who is leading them and where are they going? Again, it's this pedagogy concept. They're being led, they're being drawn somewhere. And the question is, where are they going? And this to me is, I guess, this is what blew my mind when I first discovered classical education. It was 20 years ago. How the ancients took so seriously the inextricable link between education and culture, education, society. And again, I think now we're all seeing that. We're seeing that with the woke insanity that's pervading our classrooms. I think that's at least the one, if I could call it, sort of bizarre, or grotesque advantage. I think of that, where parents for the first time are overtly realizing that classroom and culture are intimately related. But we're late to the party in this. When the ancient mind, particularly the ancient Greeks, recognized that connection, they had a wonderful term for it. You and I spent hours discussing it, and it's a term called paideia for our listeners who've never heard that before. It's the same root word for pediatrician. It actually means child, but you've done a lot of work in this. Give us a basic overview of this classical notion of paideia and how it related just to this broader notion of culture.
Well, I think a few minutes ago you talked a little bit about the idea of time and the fact that we can't necessarily define it, but we use it all the time. And I think what's happened with paideia is that prior to the Greeks naming it and intentionally trying to cultivate a paideia in children that was liberating or freeing, the world was a pretty dark place. There was one form of government, and that was pretty much emperors and dictators that did everything for the sake of some pagan god, and enslaved basically 90% of the population. And so this was life until the Greeks said, wait a minute, why do people keep following this stuff? And they realized it was paideia. They were raised up as children in a context where the emperor of Persia or the king of Persia was worshipped and some kind of demigod. And therefore, that's all they knew. That's all they could really think about. And so when the Greeks said, what would happen if we created a democracy and we allowed people to govern themselves without such a emperor or dictator? The first thing we'd have to do is have independent minds who could think freely and be able to engage ideas instead of just falling for whatever idea is told to them by some authority somewhere. And so they invented paideia as the West has become, came to know it. And as a consequence, after the Greeks and particularly after the Romans, the whole West was permeated with the Western Christian paideia, which is what we talk about in the book a lot, the Western Christian paideia. And that changed the world. And it changed the world so much that our world today is not even any way of describing it, even 200 years ago, is so different than the world at the time that the Greeks invented this thing. And it was all because of this Western Christian paideia, and we took it for granted. Like I said, it's like time. You don't think about it. Nobody really thought about it. And when you take something for granted long enough, whether it's your health, whether it's your children, whether it's your wife, if you take them for granted for too long, you pretty soon forget and stop trying to cultivate that which is so precious. And that's what we did. That's how paideia fell off the table. And that's what in the book, we start in chapter 3 or 4 with the story of how the progressives intentionally did this. It was not an accident. It was it was an intentional act, and the progressives' fingerprints were all over it.
Yeah, and it's what I love about your book too is you note it's not like paideia left. We still have a paideia, but it's a radically secularized, very Marxist cultural conception that students are getting initiated into, which stands in such stark contrast to really the liberating, hence the liberal arts liberating vision that the ancient Greeks had. What I really like about this book is I think few people actually appreciate just how differently our founding fathers, for example, viewed an educated person than we do. When we think of an educated person, we tend to think of somebody who's just got their head filled with crammed with all this kind of information. But they tended to think of an educated person more in terms of formation. And I don't think we realize how the role of virtue formation, how central of a role that played in the education of our founding fathers, precisely because virtue formation was so central to Athens and Jerusalem and Rome, the three great cities upon which classical education is founded. C.S. Lewis, a little bibliography for people. C.S. Lewis talks about this in his amazing book, Abolition of Man, which is a book that David and I talked about for hours. And when modern people hear this term virtue, they often think of it as being good or just being upstanding. They think of it in moralist sort of terms, when in point of fact, virtue historically was inextricably linked to our loves. Which again seems so foreign to us. Can you tease that out for us? Just what is this relationship, generally speaking, about virtue and love, and how it relates to classical education?
Yeah, well, that's a great point, Steve. I tell a little story in the book about my time at Hewlett-Packard when I was working in the tech industry. And you would think that science, we're told today that science and reason are what make good decisions. And so all decisions ostensibly are scientific or reason-based if they're good decisions. I was in a meeting once where there was a debate going on between two sides of an engineering problem where the tolerances on a particular part were close to one edge of the acceptable range, but they were within the acceptable range. And the argument that was going on in the room, I sat there, I was in marketing, I wasn't an engineer, so I didn't have a lot to say about the tolerances, but it was fun to watch the discussion because what it really was a debate between two affections. There was one engineer who had an affection or a disaffection for risk and wanted safety at all costs. And so being near one edge of the tolerance was too much, and she wanted it completely redesigned. Another engineer was in the justice category. He loved justice. And for him, there was a tolerance for a reason. If it's within the tolerances, it's just. And if it's just, it should go forward. So this affection for justice and affection for safety were the two affections that really made that decision. The people in the room were in varying degrees, having affections for either one of those two things. And ultimately what came out was a scientific decision, one of the most scientific you could make on, the manufacturing of a part, that was really just about affections. And people don't realize that affections are really what make every single decision we make in life. There is no decision made outside of an affection. Human affections are the bread and butter of culture and the bread and butter of our lives together. But we think it's all reason and scientific thought.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's sort of a super rationalism. And then we don't realize that we love that. we love it being that way. The affections always seem to be hidden behind the scenes, but the ancients seem to have
I was just going to interject, and it's really an affection for reason that is central to a classical education. That's what the first three liberal arts, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, are about, is training the virtue of reason. So effectively, reason itself is a virtue. And so training the virtue of reason is the central theme of the first three of the liberal arts.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. What made C.S. Lewis so fascinating was the way he recognized that in the classical world, they trained what he would call the whole soul, the logos, ethos, and pathos, as Aristotle would put it, the mind and the affections. And so students learn to see the world rightly and love the world rightly. But then in the modern age, we've split those two apart. So now, we have the situation where you may be a biological, male or female, but gender is a whole different thing, and your disposition and your inclination there is really what's important. It's not so much the biology. So they've been split apart, as it were, and they're almost at war. I won't even say almost, but are at war with each other. Yes. It's really quite fascinating. You're seeing that on the left, interestingly enough. So you see the Bill Maher's and the Piers Morgans, even to a certain extent, someone like Jordan Peterson, who would have said 5 years ago he had been considered on the center left. You've got these guys who are really still in love with critical thinking and science and so forth, and they're being totally marginalized and pushed away by this new woke left that's all affection, and any sense of logic or reason has just been completely jettisoned because it's unfair. It's there's no equity or what have you. And so I think this is the revenge of the ancients. The ancients are coming back and they're saying, "We told you, you've got to train the affections. Or if you have untrained, unbridled affections, look out. Your society is not going to do very well."
Yep.
Well, no, I think yeah, please.
No, go ahead.
No, I think it's so interesting too, because our founding fathers, Os Guinness got into this a bit. We forget that they placed virtue really at the heart of our republic, where they said, they called it, I guess, the obedience to the unenforceable. But the argument here was that the only true way we could cultivate virtue that we were self-governing people, was through faith. And so this is the very public civic role of Christianity, in particular, the Christian church, as the principle of ordering our loves, ordering and cultivating our virtues. But then they would say that the only way we could have true faith is through freedom, because faith couldn't be coerced. The only way we can have true faith is through freedom. But the only way we could have true freedom is through virtue, which requires faith, which requires freedom, which requires virtue. So this is what Os Guinness refers to as that golden triangle of freedom upon which our nation is founded. So it seems classical education, ironically, in terms of its emphasis on virtue, was actually at the heart. That paideia was at the heart of birthing the nation that we that those of us who are, of course, in the United States have been so blessed by. So what happened? Can you give us yeah.
One of we talk about in the book, it's kind of interesting. So you divide the founding fathers, we do kind of into three categories, although there's really two: the deists and the Christians. We don't hear a lot about the Christians like John Jay or Patrick Henry, but we hear a lot about Thomas Jefferson, Madison. What's really neat is what you just said about virtue. Both of them, because the colonies, and particularly American colonies, still had that Puritan lean, which had trained the virtues. And so what you saw in the American Revolution was that whether you're a Thomas Jefferson who tries to take God out of the Bible by, getting rid of miracles in the Bible, or you're a John Jay or Samuel Adams or one of those guys, you can come together and agree virtuously on the Constitution and on the Bill of Rights, because those things transcend, sort of which side of that category you're on. However, in France, there was not such a situation. The situation was very different. The Huguenots had long been they were the Protestant French, had long been either killed or chased out. The lower classes didn't have very much paideia in the cultivation of virtue. The aristocrats were all beheaded. And so the reign of terror and the structure of the French Revolution, what was that, 1794, I think, 1793, somewhere in there, is very different than the almost contemporary time period of the American Revolution.
Right. Wow, that's fascinating. And it's so interesting, too. I just recently read this, that, the motto that came out of that French Revolution was liberty and equality. And scholars have noticed that since then, those two virtues split apart. So now, in many ways, right, they turned into the conservatives and the liberals, as it were. The conservatives were more for the liberty side of things, and now the left is radical equality, radical egalitarianism, and the like. So sort of capitalism and communism, so splitting apart because they had no transcendent order to hold them together. It's kind of like what G.K. Chesterton said, where it's not like the virtues disappeared when Christendom imploded. They just went mad. they went nuts. So love wins at the expense of law and reason and so on. It's fascinating stuff. So I mean, can you give us just you mentioned that this was deliberate, that the erasing of virtue as the central attribute of an educated person, that was very deliberate starting in the 19th century. Can you just give us flesh it out in just brief terms? What happened?
Well, Karl Marx happened, and he created a whole new virtue system based on equity, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And he predicted that the oppressed would overthrow the oppressors. And it didn't happen. They tried to force it to happen in Russia, but generally speaking, it didn't happen. And so in the what we talk about in the book is really, it starts in the earliest decades of the 20th century, in 1900 and about 1920, 1930, where the progressives realized that the Western Christian paideia was never going to allow them to create the conflict between the classes in society. As long as the Christian worldview was present, it was never going to be, they were never going to be able to advance their agenda the way they wanted to. So they had the foresight to say, we will build. And now they've lied to us and told us it was always there, but they chose to build what is now the American public school system between about 1905 and 1930. Now, there's a few indicators that this was a true build project. It wasn't there previously. Any of us who are old enough may have had great grandparents who only had an 8th grade education. And when you're told that, you're often thinking, oh, they must have been really poor or really, uneducated. But the reality was the education didn't go past the 8th grade in America unless a preparatory school to send 0.5% to colleges was it. And so in reality, the whole high school system in the United States and all of the system that fed it in K through 8 was built by the progressives in the 1905 to 1930 timeframe. We talk in the book about the Gary Plan, which was they set up these model schools all over the country to try and figure out how to do this. But to answer your question more directly, the replacement of virtue was necessary because virtue trumps efforts to recast the ethical system that we live in. So if you want to create a cultural Marxist paideia where atheism is ensconced and the idea of oppressor-oppressed politics is a given, you have to change the virtue system. And paideia was far too strong for them to do unless they actually extricated Christianity completely from the schools, which is what they did with something called the American paideia. It's kind of interesting. One of the stories I tell with the book sometimes is that when Pete Hegseth originally approached me about classical Christian education, he was looking for kind of a patriot angle on things. And there is a patriot angle, but in the reality, it's kind of a flip the script sort of story where the early progressives wanted Christianity out of the classroom. And since Americans in the 1905 timeframe were not about ready to kick virtue out of the classroom, they built up something called the American paideia. And that's what Lawrence Kremen, the guy that I got a lot of the progressive material from, he was a professor at Columbia College. He says they deliberately replaced the catechism with the Pledge of Allegiance. They replaced the creeds with the Pledge of Allegiance, the putting pictures of George Washington and John Dewey on the above the blackboard instead of Jesus or a cross. Those were all acts to extricate any form of virtue left over from the Western Christian paideia. And they succeeded because by 1950, we barely remembered Christ was ever in the classroom.
Right.
And by 1960, it became illegal to have him anywhere near the classroom. And people think 1960s when it started, that's really when it was codified. That was just the end. That was the fat lady was singing at that point.
That's right. That's right. We're reaping what had already been sown decades earlier. So it's so fascinating and it's so true. It's one of the reasons why I tend to refer to the kind of the nationalisms that we're seeing around the world today as the new nationalism or neo-nationalism, because it really is a nationalism that wants to go back to the pre-secularized 20th century nationalisms that did turn out to be catastrophic. They were imperialists. They were horrible. But this kind of nationalism today is trying to go back. I mean, we talk about that dynamic re-traditionalization that's going around, that fancy schmancy word, just simply returning back to our customs, our cultures, particularly our religious traditions. And for me, that's where this whole rediscovery of classical education has been so unbelievably exciting. You know, both you and I have had the same discovery. And, you know, what for you, David, is you're right at the heart of this movement. What for you does this return to classical education mean for our nation and even more importantly for the church?
Well, that's a great question, Steve. And in some ways, I don't know. That's in the hands of God. He is controlling all things for His glory, and we hope and pray that classical education fits in there to help restore that to the church. There's a bunch of different things that we're trying to achieve. One, as I just mentioned, is the church. I think the church got pulled off sides quite a little bit. It was told initially to step away from things like orphanages and hospitals and not, leave those to the secular government, not, turn them over to the government. And eventually it became the church has no place in everyday life. Right. So then you get, I think it was Johnson who passes a law that the church, you can't even talk about politics from the pulpit. And this is all part and parcel of saying that church and Christianity is irrelevant, when in fact, religion is the most relevant thing to any culture. Amen. And right now we are living in a culture that is rapidly transforming from the Western Christian paideia. It takes a generation or two to do it because of the way paideia works, but right. It's rapidly transforming right now. And that's what happened with the book. I mean, when Pete agreed to do this, it was really just because he loved the topic. We didn't anticipate selling a ton of books. We knew it was, obviously a guy like Pete Hegseth and a publisher like HarperCollins, you're going to sell some books, but we didn't anticipate it was going to be on the top of the New York Times bestseller list for 4 weeks, and right. Still on there today. It's been there for quite a while, not at the top, but it ranges up and down. But that kind of acceptance was due to the timing, we think. People suddenly in 2020 looked out their window, and when the rioters were running by, or when the masked police were coming, or when the LGBTQ crowd was enforcing its will, or the transients were wandering around. I mean, this all just happened suddenly, and right. People are going, "What happened?" What happened? And, you don't realize it took 100 years for the progressives to dismantle the Western Christian paideia. And since 2020, we've been looking the cultural Marxist paideia straight in the face.
Right. Right. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. That's why I call it almost sort of a grotesque blessing, in the sense that it's forcing the right questions. It's making people, it's shaping the right categories to be able to analyze, what is this connection between classroom and culture and the like? And the renaissance of classical education has been unbelievable just over the last few decades. It really, the pace by which it's grown has been astonishing, just even since I got involved with it. Can you just give us a sense? You've got all the stats and numbers there. How many, do you remember how many classical schools there were, say, like in the mid 1990s versus how many there are today?
Yeah, well, in 1991, there was one. Actually, there were three. We talk about this in the book. So you go from about 3 in 1991 till probably 1999, there were around 100 classical schools. So that's a sudden burst onto the scene. Those 100 were small, so they didn't represent that many students. But then by 2005 or so, you were up to 200, and by 2010, it was 240. Then we've really hockey sticked in the last few years. We're sitting right now, we're I think 475 in the ACCS, and it's been climbing rapidly since about 2012. And a lot of it is that parents have just, this, Steve. You were the real deal. You taught in the heart of the rhetoric school, and you walk into a school like that, and parents are starting to walk into these and realize this is nothing like the school down the road. I know you taught in the rhetoric department, but aesthetics was your study area. I'll bet you that word isn't even on a syllabus anywhere else in the country, unless it's a classical Christian school. So I think the growth has been rapid because parents have they've walked into the classrooms and went, I don't know what this is. I don't understand what he's talking about. but it's beautiful. And because it's beautiful, I want my kids here.
And beauty awakens our loves. So it draws our loves and our affections to it. Yep. It's just, oh, it's wonderful. Oh, I get goosebumps. I could talk about this for hours, David. And we have. We most certainly have. Where can people find out more about your work? The book, of course, is Battle for the American Mind. And where can they find out more about classical education as a whole?
Well, classicalchristian.org has, it's our flagship site where you can get the school finder. One that I send a lot of people to is classicaldifference.org. So it's a little different, classicaldifference.org. That's set up to take you on a journey to learn more. It has a bit on there from Miseducation of America, which is the documentary that Pete and I made before we did the book. And of course, it has links to the book. You can get the book anywhere. My favorite, Costco, has them right now, or at least it does in most of the country. So you can pick it up there. It'll give you the history and the background. But if you really want to get involved, it's classicalchristian.org.
And you do some writing as well. Don't you have a? Do you have a Substack?
Oh yes, yes. I have a Substack. I do David Goodwin or davidgoodwin.substack.com. That's just a place where once we wrote the book, a lot of people started asking. I think people view classical education a lot as sort of an eccentric hobby, or maybe sort of an out there kind of weird thing. So what we're trying to do at the Substack, and it's free, it's a free Substack, is connect the dots between, this is what's happening today in Washington or in your backyard or wherever in the world. And this is what classical education can bring to helping you understand what's going on. And so that's what we're doing. So that's the Substack.
Brilliant resources, gang. They are rich and wonderful. Battle for the American Mind. Grab it and check out all those resources that we have under the video and the hyperlinks there. I say it again without any hint of hyperbole or exaggeration whatsoever. If you are looking for the single best education in the world, I'll say that again, the single best education in the world for your children, this is it. That is precisely what David represents. And I know this firsthand. I was in the world of classical education for 18 straight years, and there's simply no other education that can come close to what classical education offers for your children, for your grandchildren. All my children have been immersed in it, and David Goodwin is at the very heart of it. So grab the book, subscribe to his Substack, and most importantly, get your kids in a local classical school. David, it was so awesome to see you again. Let's keep in touch.
Yes. Thanks, Steve. It's good to see you.